September 11, 1945, Fort Bliss, Texas. The desert heat shimmers above the tarmac as military transport planes touch down one after another, their cargo more valuable and more disturbing than any weapon. Human beings who designed instruments of death. Among the passengers descending the stairs is Dr. Wernher von Braun, 33 years old, wearing an ill-fitting civilian suit that cannot conceal what he was mere months ago. An SS officer, a Nazi party member, architect of the weapon that rained fire on London. His fingers, which once signed off on slave labor requisitions at the Mittelwerk factory, now clutch American immigration papers. Behind him, 117 more German scientists and engineers file into the blinding Texas sun. They are the first wave. Over the next 14 years, more than 1,600 will follow. This is Operation Paperclip, and its architects have made a calculated decision. America needs Nazi expertise more than it needs Nazi accountability. The men arriving today carry secrets written in equations and blueprints, knowledge purchased with the lives of 20,000 concentration camp prisoners who died building their rockets. The guards at Fort Bliss do not know this. The American public does not know this. For decades, almost no one will know this. But the documents exist, locked in classified files, waiting. The war in Europe ends on May 8, 1945, but the race for German technology begins months earlier. American intelligence officers fan across Germany with a singular mission: find the scientists before the Soviets do. They carry dossiers, photographs, and a list of names compiled by the Office of Strategic Services. At the top of nearly every list relating to rocketry is one name: Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun. Von Braun knows the Reich is collapsing. By early 1945, Soviet forces close in from the east, American and British forces from the west. The research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where his team developed the Aggregate 4 rocket, later designated Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, the V2, faces imminent capture. Von Braun makes his choice. He gathers 500 of his top engineers and scientists. He arranges their evacuation south, away from the advancing Red Army, into Bavaria, into American hands. The surrender is carefully orchestrated. Von Braun's brother, Magnus von Braun, makes first contact with American forces. The message is clear: we have knowledge you need, and we prefer American custody to Soviet capture. On May 2, 1945, Wernher von Braun surrenders to Private First Class Fred Schneikert of the 324th Infantry Regiment, 44th Infantry Division, near Reutte, Austria. With him come plans, documents, test data, and the expertise to build weapons that travel faster than sound. American officers immediately recognize the prize they have captured. The V2 is unlike anything in the Allied arsenal. A liquid propellant rocket extending 46 feet in length, weighing 27,000 pounds, capable of speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour, delivering a 2,200-pound warhead to targets 500 miles away. It is the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It is also the first human-made object to reach space, crossing the Kármán line on June 20, 1944. But the V2 carries another distinction, one that will haunt Operation Paperclip for decades. It killed more people in its production than in its deployment. Beginning September 1944, more than 3,000 V2 rockets strike Allied targets, primarily London and later Antwerp and Liège. According to British Broadcasting Corporation documentary research, these attacks kill an estimated 9,000 civilians and military personnel. Yet, in the underground factory at Mittelbau-Dora near Nordhausen, Germany, where concentration camp prisoners assemble the missiles under brutal conditions, Between 20,000 and 25,000 detainees die from exhaustion, starvation, disease, execution, and deliberate murder. The Joint Chiefs of Staff formalized the operation on July 20, 1945, initially calling it Operation Overcast. The stated objective: bring German specialists to the United States temporarily to aid the war effort against Japan. That war ends abruptly in August 1945 when atomic bombs devastate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Operation Overcast continues. The mission expands. On September 3, 1946, President Harry S. Truman signs a secret directive officially approving what is now called Operation Paperclip, authorizing the importation of 1,000 German scientists under temporary, limited military custody. The name Paperclip derives from the physical paperclips attached to the folders of those scientists deemed useful to American interests, distinguishing them from other German personnel files. But there is a problem. Many of these scientists have Nazi records. Under existing United States immigration law and military directives, individuals with significant Nazi Party involvement, SS membership, or war crimes connections should be barred from entry. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the organization administering the program, finds a solution. They sanitize the records. Files are rewritten. Nazi Party memberships are downplayed as nominal or opportunistic. SS affiliations disappear or are explained away as administrative necessities for career advancement in the Third Reich. Involvement with concentration camp labor is omitted entirely. Intelligence officers craft new dossiers that paint the German specialists as apolitical scientists who worked reluctantly under Nazi rule. These falsified documents pass through immigration review. By late 1946, American news media begin revealing the program's existence, but the full scope of the deception remains classified for decades. February 1946, Fort Bliss, Texas. 118 German specialists arrive at the United States Army post in the desert northeast of El Paso. They are housed in converted World War II barracks within a 6-acre ordnance area, initially confined to this small perimeter. Their task: help American engineers understand, assemble, and launch the V-2 rockets whose components arrived in 300 freight carloads at White Sands Proving Ground in August 1945. Wernher von Braun becomes the public face of the German rocket team, though his past remains carefully obscured. Born March 23, 1912 in Virsitz, Prussia, von Braun showed early brilliance in mathematics and physics. His fascination with spaceflight began in adolescence after reading Hermann Oberth's book, The Rocket into Planetary Space. He studied engineering in Berlin and joined the German Society for Space Travel, where his work attracted the attention of the German Army's Artillery Division in 1932. By 1937, von Braun led the team at Peenemünde developing military rockets. Von Braun joined the Nazi Party on May 1, 1937. In 1940, he joined the SS, eventually receiving the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major. Later, he claimed these memberships were mandatory for career advancement, that refusal would have ended his rocket research. Documents declassified in the 1980s and 90s reveal a more complex picture. Von Braun attended SS meetings, signed documents requisitioning concentration camp labor, and visited the Mittelwerk factory where prisoners assembled V-2 rockets under horrific conditions. He was, at minimum, aware of and complicit in the system that murdered thousands. Yet in 1946, in the Texas desert, these facts remain classified. To American military officers and the nascent aerospace industry, von Braun is a valuable asset, perhaps the most valuable. He understands liquid propellant rocket technology better than any American engineer, He can accelerate United States missile development by years, perhaps decades. As tensions with the Soviet Union deteriorate into what will be called the Cold War, the moral calculus shifts. We need them for our weapons programs. Or, at minimum, we must deny their knowledge to the Soviets. At White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, 70 miles northeast of Fort Bliss, the captured V-2 rockets prepare for launch. General Electric, under the Project Hermes contract, handles rocket assembly and preparation. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Guided Missile Battalion, organized at Fort Bliss in October 1945, provides support personnel. The German specialists serve as advisors and technicians, translating their wartime experience into American applications. The first assembled V-2 launches from White Sands on April 16, 1946. It rises on a column of flame and smoke, climbs 5 miles into the desert sky, then crashes. The second attempt succeeds. Over the following years, American engineers and German specialists launch approximately 70 V-2 rockets, studying their flight characteristics, testing modifications, pushing the boundaries of what is possible. These launches serve dual purposes: weapons development for the emerging Cold War arms race and scientific research into the upper atmosphere and near-space environment. Von Braun uses his position to advocate publicly for spaceflight. He writes articles for popular magazines, appears on television programs, collaborates with Walt Disney on educational films about space exploration. He speaks eloquently about humanity's destiny among the stars, about peaceful uses of rocket technology, about scientific progress. He does not speak about Mittelbau-Dora. He does not speak about the prisoners who died. He does not speak about the day in 1944 when he was briefly arrested by the Gestapo for allegedly misusing Nazi funds to pursue manned spaceflight research, instead of focusing solely on weapons development. The Mittelwerk factory at Kohnstein Mountain, near Nordhausen, operated from August 1943 until April 1945. The facility consisted of 2 parallel tunnels, each nearly 1 mile long, connected by 46 cross-tunnels, all carved into the mountain to protect V-2 production from Allied bombing. Concentration camp prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora performed the excavation and assembly work under conditions designed to extract maximum labor before death. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts 7 days per week in the cold, damp tunnels. Ventilation was inadequate, the air filled with rock dust, chemical fumes, and the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Prisoners slept initially in the tunnels themselves, 4 tiers of bunks stacked in the cross-tunnels, without sanitation facilities, without adequate food, without medical care. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten. Those who could not continue were shot or hanged. The SS guards maintained discipline through random violence and public executions. 350 prisoners were hanged during the factory's operation, including 200 executed for suspected sabotage. Arthur Louis Hugo Rudolph served as operations director of the Mittelwerk from late 1943 to 1945. Born November 9, 1906, in Stepfershausen, Germany, Rudolph joined the Nazi Party in 1931, before Hitler's rise to power. He worked at Peenemünde before transferring to manage V-2 production at Mittelbau-Dora. His role involved overseeing assembly operations, managing labor allocation, and meeting production quotas. He signed requisitions for concentration camp workers. He toured the factory floor where prisoners labored. In testimony he later gave to United States investigators, Rudolph admitted witnessing prisoners hanged from an overhead crane in the underground factory. Of the roughly 60,000 people who passed through Mittelbau-Dora and its subcamps, an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 died. Dr. Michael Neufeld, space history curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, calculated that a minimum of 10,000 deaths could be attributed directly to the V-2 program at Mittelwerk, with the remainder linked to other projects, particularly the fighter program that used the tunnels for aircraft production. This created the rocket's most disturbing statistic. Twice as many people died producing the V-2 than died from its deployment as a weapon. And the 10,000 figure accounts only for Mittelbau-Dora deaths. Concentration camp prisoners worked at many other V-2 program facilities, including Peenemünde itself, adding potentially another 10,000 victims. April 11, 1945. The United States 3rd Armored Division and 104th Infantry Division reach Nordhausen. Soldiers discover the Belka Kaserne barracks filled with the dead and dying. 1,300 to 1,500 Mittelbau prisoners killed 3 days earlier, when Royal Air Force bombers attacked the city, unaware that concentration camp survivors were confined in the buildings they targeted. American soldiers find emaciated prisoners too weak to move, rooms saturated with blood, incinerators containing partially burned bodies. The reports filed by these soldiers describe scenes beyond comprehension. One report from a British Fedden mission inspection team on June 19, 1945 states, "The reaction of the mission to this visit was one of the utmost revulsion and disgust. This factory is the epitome of megalomaniac production and robot efficiency and layout. Everything was ruthlessly executed with utter disregard for humanitarian considerations. The record of Nordhausen is a most unenviable one, and we were told that 250 of the slave workers perished every day due to overwork and malnutrition." By the time Allied forces secured the area, the evidence was undeniable. Yet within months, Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and more than 100 other members of the Peenemünde and Mittelwerk teams were in the United States, working for the United States Army, their records sanitized, their pasts hidden. 1950. Von Braun's team transfers from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama. The group, now numbering approximately 127 German specialists plus their families, becomes the core of the United States Army's ballistic missile development program. They work on the Redstone rocket, a direct descendant of the V-2, designed to deliver nuclear warheads. The Cold War arms race accelerates. The moral questions about Nazi pasts fade into classified files. Additional paperclip specialists continue arriving through the 1950s, bringing the total German intake to more than 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians. The United States Air Force recruits the largest number, distributing specialists across military laboratories, universities, and private companies. They work on guided missiles, supersonic aerodynamics, aircraft design, jet and rocket engines, chemical weapons, aerospace medicine, synthetic fuels. Their expertise accelerates American technological development in fields ranging from rocketry to medicine. The program's value is later estimated at 10 billion United States dollars in patents and industrial processes. The Huntsville Germans, as von Braun's team becomes known, maintain the highest public profile. They work together, socialize together, form a distinct community within Redstone Arsenal and later within NASA. Most receive United States citizenship in 1954 and 1955 through naturalization ceremonies that ask about Nazi affiliations but rely on the falsified records provided by military intelligence. They swear oaths to uphold the Constitution of the United States. No one asks about the prisoners who died building their rockets. October 4, 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. The event stuns the American public and government. How did the Soviets achieve this first? The answer lies partially in Operation Osoaviakim, the Soviet equivalent of Paperclip, which relocated more than 2,200 German specialists and their families, over 6,000 people total, in a single night on October 22, 1946, from the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. Like the Americans, the Soviets recognized the value of German rocket expertise and seized it without excessive concern for Nazi pasts. The space race begins in earnest. The United States rushes to respond to Sputnik. On January 31, 1958, von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal, working with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, successfully launches Explorer-1, America's first satellite, atop a modified Jupiter C rocket derived directly from V2 technology. Von Braun becomes a national hero, featured on the cover of magazines, interviewed on television, celebrated as the man who will take America to the moon. In 1960, von Braun's division transfers from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency to the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He becomes director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. Under his leadership, the team develops the Saturn family of rockets, culminating in the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The Saturn V stands 363 feet tall, weighs 6.2 million pounds at launch, and generates 7.6 million pounds of thrust from its first-stage engines. It is an engineering marvel, the vehicle that will carry astronauts to the moon. July 16, 1969. Apollo 11 launches from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, atop a Saturn V rocket. 4 days later, on July 20th, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin land on the lunar surface while Michael Collins orbits above. Armstrong's first steps on the moon, broadcast live to hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide, represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. The Saturn V rocket, designed under Wernher von Braun's direction, has fulfilled John F. Kennedy's goal of landing Americans on the moon before the end of the decade. Von Braun receives praise, awards, recognition. NASA honors him with the Distinguished Service Medal. He appears before Congress. He advises presidents. His past as an SS officer who signed documents requisitioning slave labor remains classified, known only to a small number of intelligence officials and investigators who are sworn to secrecy. 1969. Arthur Rudolph, who managed V2 production at the Mittelwerk factory where thousands of prisoners died, receives NASA's Distinguished Service Award for his work as project director of the Saturn V rocket program. The award citation praises his exceptional leadership and outstanding technical contributions that enabled the Apollo missions. NASA presents him with a medal and a certificate. Photographs show him smiling, shaking hands with NASA officials, a respected aerospace engineer celebrated for his achievements. No one at the ceremony mentions Mittelbau Dora. No one mentions the prisoners hanged from the overhead crane that Rudolph admitted witnessing. No one mentions the 12-hour shifts in the cold tunnels, the starvation rations, the systematic murder disguised as industrial production. Rudolph's NASA files, like those of other Paperclip scientists, contain sanitized biographies that omit or minimize his Nazi Party membership and his role in the concentration camp system. For decades, this remains the official narrative. German rocket scientists, reluctant servants of the Nazi regime, came to America, embraced democratic values, and helped the United States win the space race. It is a narrative of redemption, of knowledge transcending politics, of science serving peace rather than war. It is also, in significant measure, a lie, constructed by intelligence agencies to obscure the moral compromises made in the name of national security. The truth begins emerging in the 1970s. Investigative journalists, prompted by questions about war criminals living in the United States, start examining Operation Paperclip more closely. They file Freedom of Information Act requests for declassified documents. They interview former intelligence officers. They discover the file sanitization program, the deliberate falsification of Nazi records, the cover-up of war crimes involvement. In 1973, the United States House of Representatives holds hearings on Operation Paperclip. Congressional investigators review declassified files and conclude that American military leaders made morally bankrupt decisions, justified by national security concerns. The hearings reveal the extent of Nazi affiliations among Paperclip recruits. Roughly half were Nazi Party members, many held SS ranks, and several had direct involvement with concentration camp labor and war crimes. Yet they entered the United States, received security clearances, worked on classified military projects, and eventually received citizenship, all while their true backgrounds remained hidden. The hearings lead to the creation of the Office of Special Investigations within the United States Department of Justice in 1979. The OSI's mission: identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals living in America. The office begins investigating Paperclip scientists, reviewing newly declassified files, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence. 1982. The Office of Special Investigations opens an investigation into Arthur Rudolph. Investigators review his Mittelwerk files, interview survivors of Mittelbau-Dora, examine wartime documents. The evidence accumulates. Rudolph held authority over production operations where prisoners died by the thousands. He signed requisitions for concentration camp labor. He toured the factory and witnessed hangings. Survivors testify that he was present when prisoners were beaten and executed. He knew about the conditions and did nothing to stop them, because stopping them would have slowed production, and production was the priority. In 1984, facing potential prosecution for war crimes, Arthur Rudolph negotiates an agreement with the Office of Special Investigations. Rather than face trial, he will leave the United States permanently and renounce his American citizenship. On March 10, 1984, Rudolph departs for West Germany. The Justice Department releases a brief statement on October 17, 1984, announcing that Rudolph was involved in the mistreatment of forced laborers, including inmates of concentration camps who worked there under appalling conditions. The statement is carefully worded, legally precise, and thoroughly inadequate to describe what happened at Mittelbau-Dora. Rudolph avoids prosecution because West Germany's statute of limitations on Nazi crimes has expired for all but murder, and sufficient evidence for murder charges cannot be assembled 40 years after the fact. He was not on the Allied list of war criminals compiled immediately after the war, a list that focused on high-ranking officials rather than production managers. He lives quietly in Germany until his death in 1996, never facing trial, never imprisoned, never punished beyond losing his American citizenship. The revelation about Rudolph prompts questions about his NASA Distinguished Service Award. Should the medal be revoked? Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, who drafted legislation allowing deportation of Nazis, sends a telegram to President Ronald Reagan. It is a disgrace for an American medal to remain in the hands of this bestial killer. In 1985, Representative Bill Green introduces legislation to force NASA to rescind the award. During appropriations hearings, NASA's general counsel misleads Green about legal protections in Rudolph's departure agreement, and Green abandons the effort. The medal remains officially awarded. NASA never revokes it. Werner von Braun dies on June 16, 1977, from pancreatic cancer in Alexandria, Virginia. He is 65 years old. Obituaries praise his vision, his technical genius, his contributions to space exploration. President Jimmy Carter issues a statement. To millions of Americans, Werner von Braun's name was inextricably linked to our exploration of space and to the creative application of technology. He was not only a skillful engineer, but also a man of bold vision. His inspirational leadership helped mobilize and maintain the effort we needed to reach the moon and beyond. The obituaries mention his work on the V-2 rocket in passing as historical context for his later American career. They do not dwell on the concentration camp prisoners who died. They do not discuss his SS membership or his Nazi Party involvement in detail. The full documentary evidence of his knowledge and complicity remains classified at the time of his death. He dies celebrated, honored, remembered as a hero of the space age. The 1980s and 1990s bring further declassifications. Historians gain access to wartime German documents, American intelligence files, OSI investigation records. The sanitized narratives collapse under documentary evidence. Books and scholarly articles examine Operation Paperclip more critically, assessing not just the technological benefits, but the moral costs. The declassified documents reveal that American intelligence officers knew about the Nazi pasts and concentration camp involvement of many Paperclip recruits. They knew, and proceeded anyway, deliberately falsifying records to circumvent immigration law and military directives prohibiting the importation of Nazi war criminals. The decision came from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership, justified by Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. The argument was utilitarian. The greater good of American national security and technological supremacy outweighed the moral imperative of justice for Nazi crimes. The Nazi War Crimes and Japanese Imperial Government Records Interagency Working Group, created by Congress to facilitate declassification, releases approximately 8 million pages of documents from multiple government agencies through 2005. The documentation reveals extensive relationships between former Nazis and American intelligence organizations. At least 5 associates of Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. 23 other Nazis were approached for CIA recruitment. At least 100 officers within the Gehlen Organization, a West German intelligence service sponsored by the United States, were former SD or Gestapo officers. The moral compromises of Operation Paperclip extended far beyond rocket scientists. The debate continues into the 21st century. Historians, ethicists, legal scholars, and commentators argue about Operation Paperclip's legacy. Did the technological benefits justify the moral costs? Should justice have taken precedence over strategic advantage? Could the United States have achieved the same scientific progress without recruiting Nazis? Dr. Michael Neufeld, senior curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and author of authoritative biographies of von Braun and histories of the V-2 program, offers a measured assessment. The project and related efforts to seize German knowledge did greatly benefit American science, technology, and national security in the Cold War. But we needed a better filter to screen out some of the worst offenders. In the late 40s and early 50s era of anti-communist anxiety especially, it was all too easy to obscure and excuse their Nazi past. Others argue more forcefully that Operation Paperclip represented a fundamental betrayal of justice and Allied war aims. The United States and its allies fought World War II ostensibly to defeat fascism and uphold human rights. Yet in Operation Paperclip's implementation, American officials prioritized technological acquisition over accountability for crimes against humanity. They allowed perpetrators and accomplices of atrocities to escape punishment, build comfortable lives, receive honors and awards, and die peacefully in bed rather than facing trials or imprisonment. The physical sites remain. Mittelbau Dora, liberated by American forces in April 1945 and subsequently occupied by Soviet forces when the area became part of the Soviet occupation zone on July 1, 1945, eventually became the Mittelbau Dora Memorial. Visitors can tour portions of the tunnel complex where prisoners assembled V-2 rockets. Exhibits document the camp system, the production process, the death toll. Survivors' testimonies are preserved. The names of the dead, when known, are recorded. It serves as a site of memory, education, and warning. Fort Bliss and White Sands remain active United States Army installations. The missile testing range at White Sands, where captured V-2 rockets first launched in American markings, continues serving military and civilian space programs. The history is commemorated in museums, including the White Sands Missile Range Museum and the New Mexico Museum of Space History, which maintain exhibits about Operation Paperclip and the German rocket team. Huntsville, Alabama, transformed by von Braun's presence and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, calls itself Rocket City. The United States Space and Rocket Center, a museum and visitor complex, displays rockets developed under von Braun's leadership, including a Saturn V. Von Braun's name appears throughout the city on buildings, streets, and plaques. The museum exhibits acknowledge his work on the V-2 and his Nazi past, but the emphasis remains on his contributions to American space exploration. October 23, 2025. 80 years after the first paperclip scientists arrived in America, the operation's legacy remains contested. The rockets they designed evolved into the Space Launch System and commercial launch vehicles that carry satellites, scientific instruments, and astronauts into orbit. The knowledge they brought contributed to technologies that touch nearly every aspect of modern life, from GPS navigation to weather forecasting to telecommunications. The patents and industrial processes valued at $10 billion in the 1960s would be worth exponentially more today. Yet the moral questions persist. How should societies balance technological progress against justice for atrocities? When, if ever, is it acceptable to grant immunity to perpetrators of crimes against humanity in exchange for their expertise? What does it mean that some of the 20th century's greatest technological achievements were built, in part, on knowledge gained through slave labor and mass murder? The last of the original paperclip scientists died years ago. Wernher von Braun in 1977, Arthur Rudolph in 1996. Their colleagues and contemporaries followed. No one alive today can be held criminally accountable for Operation Paperclip's implementation or for the Nazi crimes that preceded it. What remains is historical memory, documentary evidence, and the ongoing responsibility to understand how and why these decisions were made. The space race is over. The United States won. American astronauts walked on the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, a triumph of engineering, courage, and national will that remains unmatched. The rockets that carried them there bore the design heritage of the V-2, refined and enlarged by the team that built the original for Nazi Germany. The victory came with a price, paid not by Americans but by 20,000 concentration camp prisoners, whose names most people will never know, whose deaths received no medals, whose suffering was classified as inconvenient to American interests. This is Operation Paperclip's truth, documented in declassified files, survivor testimonies, and historical investigations. America chose technological supremacy over moral accountability. The choice succeeded in its stated objectives. American rockets reached the moon. American missiles deterred Soviet aggression. American aerospace dominance shaped the second half of the 20th century. Whether the choice was justified remains in question each generation must answer for itself, knowing what it cost and who paid the price.